Hey guys, welcome to another class of American-European Relations. Today, as you can see, it's a slightly different class because we're going to be talking about China, but I'm not going to be the one talking to you. It's actually going to be a good friend of mine and actually an expert on China. That is Fernando Bajo, that is joining us today from Dublin. And today's class is going to be divided into 4 different videos. Each of them is going to relate to a different topic relating to China. We're going to start with the historical overview, then we're going to go to understand current China and the Chinese government. Then we're going to talk about the human rights situation in China. And we are obviously going to finish addressing the current crisis that is affecting all of us. And that's why we're not together today in class in Pablo Lavide. That is COVID-19. So first of all, welcome, Fernando. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Pablo.
And today, well, we're going to start talking about the historical overview in China, right? Because understanding Chinese history is basic to understand what is happening nowadays in China, right, Fernando?
That is correct, Pablo. There is a lot of places where we could start in order to understand what's going on today with China. The safest option would always be to start with 1949 with the communist takeover of the country. But I'd much rather start a little bit earlier because a big part of nationalist discourse lately in China goes around the Chinese occupation, the Western occupation of China, Japanese-Chinese relationship are still fraught with a lot of that history. So I would rather quickly go over it so we have an understanding. Before I do start, I would like to let you know, guys, that what we're going to be doing today is very, 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 very on the surface. So we are not going to be learning anything in depth.
Yeah, Fernando was telling me about filming something like an hour video for each of these topics. Guys, we don't have the time. I'm sorry about that. If you have a lot of interest, we can do that, but we're going to try to keep it shorter. So sorry, Fernando.
My email, if you have any further questions, I love to talk about China all day long. However, what I would like to let you guys know from the beginning is that, first of all, we will know very little from China from this class, but we will learn something. And if you learn only one thing for this class, only one thing is that China is not a mystery, is not an inscrutable, dark, magical, mystical place. It's actually a country like many others that is very easy to understand if you take the time, if you take the interest. And whenever you hear some pundits or some talk shows just talking about China like it's a mystical, Confucian, inscrutable thing, they're just basically lazy, or they have an agenda by which they want China to remain mystical and magical, maybe because they fear the government, maybe because they fear the policies, maybe because they fear their international weight, the international policies that they endure. But definitely what we need to understand is that China is a country with a government that has clear goals, an agenda to achieve those goals, and it is therefore possible and easy to understand if you take the time. That's the number one thing I want you guys to take from this, because if I hear one more person saying, oh, China is so inscrutable, so mystical, then I would kill myself, because it's unacceptable. Now,
Fernando, going back to history, that was where we're going to start with.
Going back to history, I would like to start with the end of Imperial China. To understand what was going on, we would need to understand that the last dynasty of China, the Manchus, were not super efficient when running China. Basically, they never established a central government, a very strong central government, central administration, and they never established a central army. Therefore, they could never quite enforce power as they should have in the whole of China. A set of rebellions, internal disagreements, plagues, wars, and failure to modernize as Japan did, left China rife with internal dissent and external pressure, ripe for Western powers to abuse, which they did. And during this last dynasty, China was exploited by Japan, by all the Western powers. Even Spain had a little part of Shanghai in their power.
Really?
It's not that widely known, but we did. And what I want you to take out of this, you should read about the Manchu dynasty. It's fascinating. But what I want you to take from it is that China was weak, was not able to enforce power centrally, that created a lot of mini bosses all around China, and that when time came for China to try to modernize and step up in the international arena at the end of the 19th century, they weren't able to, and they were steamrolled by Japan, by Germany, by Austria, by Italy, by everyone, literally. It was kind of a mess. So moving on, we go to a nationalist government after the end of the Imperial China, a nationalist government that scrambles to enforce a centralized control, but cannot because they are too far behind. So they start creating alliances with local war bosses and administrations to try to create the coherence, the image of a joint China. They kind of succeed, but in the meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party is gaining traction, gaining control, rebelling against these local governments, about these local war bosses, against the nationalist government, which has some totalitarian tendencies. So the Communist Party of China is rising up and is rising to the challenge. And they engage in a war that lasts almost 20 years, vying for control of China. The only time that this war more or less ceases is when, with the invasion of Japan. This creates an easy truce between Chinese nationalist government and Communist Party of China. That was never quite respected by either of them. They both still engage in war, but not so openly. The idea was that the common enemy was Japan, and they were racing to it. Funny enough, I want you guys to take that for China, World War II was never World War II. It was just the second, was the Sino-Japanese War. Japan invaded China way before the outbreak of the Second World War, but for many historians, that is the outbreak of the Second World War, the time that Japan invaded China, because literally it's the first time that Axis nation is invading an allied nation. So I think that is a very interesting point, that we always talk about Poland and Germany, but never actually about Japan and China. So the main take that I want you guys to take from this phase of the thing is that the nationalist government was unable to rise to the challenge and committed way more mistakes militarily than the communists did. The communist was very toughened by the war against the nationalism army, so they were able to better resist Japanese occupation. They were used to fight asymmetric wars, so they were quite adept at resisting Japan. And by the end of the Second World War, 1945, that left them better prepared to fight against the nationalist government again. So as soon as the war was over, communists and nationalists were at war again. They never stopped being at war, but legally they were at war again, and fought they did.
And this happened.
Yes, and so basically from 1945 to 1949, the nationalist government is slowly drawn out and put out of, it's literally pushed away from mainland China, and they take refuge in Taiwan in 1949. This gives China to the communists, to Mao Zedong, and this signifies the end of the war. However, Mao makes a mistake by not trying to take Taiwan directly. That would have been very costly, and so that makes the existence of Taiwan nowadays possible. The fact that the nationalists took refuge there, and Mao didn't root them out directly, and then Taiwan was able to position itself both internationally and nationally in a way that was very difficult for the Communist Party of China to try to invade them, even though it might have the military might. And so I will not take very long to explain about Mao Zedong. It's a fascinating figure, but you just need to understand that Mao Zedong was much like Franco, a very lucky person, was in the right place in the right time to take the position he did. And also, unlike Franco, he was a military genius. He was really adept at guerrilla warfare. He was a great thinker and a great military leader. So that primed him to be in the position that he was later on. Mm-hmm. So starting in 1949, what we have is a government, a Chinese government, communist, that is not recognized by any country in the world. At the beginning, the Taiwanese government was, the Republic of China government was considered the only legitimate representative of Chinese people all over the world because of the Cold War. By 1949, we have the Cold War gearing up. If not at full swing, it was pretty much at full swing. So Republic of China, meaning Taiwan, quickly aligned itself with the United States because, of course, the United States could not abide a China that belonged to the communists. Mm-hmm. If you want to learn about a little bit more about the United States stance against the Chinese government, the communist Chinese government, learn about the "Who Lost China" mindset. It is fascinating. It's a fascinating period of time, by some months, that the Senate of the United States was wondering who allowed for this to happen. How could we allow the biggest country in the world to fall into the hands of the communists? Uh-huh. And as I said, from 1949-50 to 1972, China was literally represented by Taiwan in the National Council of the United Nations. Sorry, on the Council of the United Nations, and was virtually unheard in the international organizations because of United States pressure. Mm-hmm. However, it is by 1972, it was clear to the United States that China was no friend of Russia, of the Soviet Union, better. So China and the Soviet Union started off as friends. Russia, the Soviet Union was quick to try to help China, but a mixture of interpersonal bad relationships with Mao Zedong and some of the Soviet leaders, and also quite a lot of competing areas of interest for China and Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And overall, a very strong feeling of anti-interventionism by China. China was very, very opposed to interventionism, which was one of the pillars for both Soviet Union and United States. Mm-hmm. That caused China to split with the Soviet Union. Basically, the relationship was nominal. They were friends, they were comrades, but they were, by the end of the 1950s, early 60s, they were no longer strong allies. Mm-hmm. So by 1970s, the United States was prepared to make an offer to China in order to further take them away from the Soviet Union and weaken the power of the Soviet Union in the international sphere. Mm-hmm. China officially took a policy of non-interventionism. Basically, China was one of the founding members of the non-aligned movement in the international relationships. And what I want you guys to take from this is that one of the basic pillars for China is non-interventionism, nominally. Less and less so as time goes by. But at the beginning is every country by themselves sort out their own messes, sort out their own problems. Probably it came out from their weakened position at their start of their international life, meaning they came from a period of occupation, both by Japan and previously by Western powers. So they were very opposed to any kind of interventionism by any state other than China. And so basically that 1972, 71, 72 is when Nixon administration, if I am not mistaken, helps China to take a seat on the United Nations. It's unparalleled. And slowly but surely that allows China to gain over the power that they thought was due to them because of their weight internationally.
Uh-huh. Perfect, Fernando. I mean, I think that's a fantastic, condensed historical overview of Chinese history to try to understand how we got here and what the role of China in international relation is. Now we're going to have a small break. You can join us again in the following video that we're going to be talking about how we have to understand China. So see you in a bit. Bye, Fernando.